The best and the worst mechs in the history of Hearthstone. We've had a lot of mechs throughout the course of the game. Trying to pick the ones that belonged on each of these lists was not an easy task. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts after watching the video. Before we get into it, I do want to thank our sponsor for this video, Squarespace. It's really the ultimate website building tool. We'll talk about that a little more later. But for now, let's jump into the 5 worst mechs of all time. Starting off here at the number 5 spot, it's Mortuary Machine. And this is a card like I kind of thought was going to be halfway decent. I think I even gave this like 3 stars in a card review. Double check that for accuracy. But my thought was, hey, we've seen a lot of 5 mana 8/8s in the past make sense. Like people were running these 5 mana 8/8s with Downside, Bittertide, Hydra, Fellweaver, etc. Maybe Mortuary Machine's the next in that line. Turns out those were in a different era of Hearthstone where stats mattered more. There wasn't a Zephyrus around every corner with a Shadow Word Death. And today, when Mortuary Machine is still in standard format, it just doesn't quite make the cut. Not to mention, giving stuff Reborn is really, really bad in a rush world. So Mortuary Machine just gives rush minions all the time Reborn. They get that instant 2-for-1 trade. They often kill it really easily. Your opponent gets huge upsides. And then, of course, when it came into standard, Ziliax was everywhere too. So that was just an automatic instant counter where your opponent would get tons of lifesteal. The worst thing you'd ever want for the aggro deck that would tend to run Mortuary Machine. So I think this is really the worst of the big 5 mana 8/8s in a card that has absolutely never seen play, much to my dismay. Moving on here to the Wind Up Burglebot. Did you even remember this was a card? It's from Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. 6 mana 5/5. When it attacks and survives, you draw a card. Now compare this to our good friend Twilight Runner that we're seeing in standard format everywhere today. It's like, what is the deal? The difference between these cards is crazy. Runner is a mana cheaper. It has stealth by default. It still has a minion type tag. It draws 2 cards and it doesn't have to survive. It's literally better in every way except it's missing 1 health, but it has a billion other upsides. And of course, Wind Up Burglebot was way, way too slow to ever work. First off, really conditional delayed card draw is not something we see in Hearthstone. This card's not sticky enough or stealthy enough to survive to that stage anyway. We weren't seeing a lot of rush minions back then because the keyword didn't even exist yet. So giving this any kind of instant activation was impossible. Even in Wild today, it's just silly to try that because this card is so slow, so awkward, and so absolutely terrible compared to everything that compares with it. Moving on to the Anima Golem. This is another card you probably forgot existed. It's actually a pretty cool looking card for Warlock. Big 9/9 mech for 6 mana. Another one of those mid-game giant threats. At the end of each turn, though, if it's the only minion you have, it's going to destroy itself, which means, you want to play your big threat on turn 6, and that's all you got. Guess what? It's dead. Your opponent wants to resolve your board really easily because it's each turn. They kill your other stuff. Guess what? Your Anima Golem dies. So this card just like never actually survives on board to get off an attack. It's just way too easy to deal with. And yes, even though Warlock is a class that loves going wide on board, has lots of tokens, in Hearthstone it's just way too easy to clean all that stuff up, making this a really, really awkward card to play in almost every scenario, whether that's dictated by your opponent or just the board state. It's so risky to ever really commit to the Anima Golem, and that's why you've never seen this card. You totally forgot it existed, and it has not seen, as far as I'm aware, any degree of play. Moving on to our second worst card here, it's the Alarmobot. Of course, a staple classic card everybody's tried to make work about 1,000,000 times because you say, hey, wait a minute, this is only 3 mana, and I can cheat something huge out of my hand. That's amazing. But of course, there's a few problems there. First off, your opponent gets to dictate whether this thing lives, and it almost never does. Beyond that, you get a random minion from hand. So are you going to have something big pulled out? Well, that means you only have big stuff in hand, which means you're really hampering your curve. If you're running 2 Alarmobots, you always pull out the other Alarmobot, it seems. So obviously this card is just totally meme. It's, you know, teasing these kind of big cheat style decks that we see in Hearthstone, but it's probably the worst way to do that possible. We have so many other cards that are much, much better at cheating out big threats or ramping you into big scary stuff. Those decks work, but they've never really utilized Alarmobot. And certainly in modern day Hearthstone, this card isn't even a consideration for anybody anymore. You just scan right past it in the collection. It is absolutely miserable. But somehow I've got a card I think might be even worse. It's the Unpowered Mauler. I've always hated this card. Maybe it's not even as bad as I think. Perhaps Alarmobot's worse if I really, really think about it. But I just hate the notion of Unpowered Mauler. It's a 2-mana 2/4. It's a very, very, very slight stat upside here. Frankly, there's a 2-mana 1/5 mech in the exact same expansion that's way better as a magnetic base with the same total amount of stats. So I don't know if I understand the Unpowered Mauler right off the bat. But anyway, it's got this condition. It can only attack if you've cast a spell this turn. So you've got this thing with, you know, marginal stat upside with a huge drawback where half the time it can't even attack. Because, of course, if you're playing things with mech synergies, magnetic, you're playing a lot of minions. You're not playing as many spells. You don't always want to play a spell on turn 3. Maybe you need this thing to attack and you're doing something awkward. You don't have the right size spell in hand. It just creates all these instant checks. So the very slight upside the stats provide suddenly don't do anything at all. It takes forever for them to actually enact. And your opponent can just trade it down in the meantime because you really didn't do much. There are just a million better, stronger mechs. There are better plays to make from a stat standpoint for everybody these days. It's just this totally useless passive card. It's not fun in any way. It's awkward to play. It's slow. It's conditional. It's just everything I hate about a bad Hearthstone card. It's just terrible, and I can't think of any reason you'd ever want to run this card. So even if it's not like technically probably worse than our good friend Alarmobot, I think it's still worse in many ways just from a design standpoint. So I'm naming it the worst mech of all time in Hearthstone. And there you go. That's it for the worst mechs. Now, before we move on to the best, I'd like to talk about our sponsor, Squarespace. I've been using Squarespace for over 10 years. That's right, starting in 2008. I got emails to prove it, and I love it. It's really the ultimate place to build a website online. They have not only great styles and templates, so your site's gonna look amazing and professional, but all kinds of tools to make your life easier, whether that's to support e-commerce, you wanna sell something awesome, or just write some blog posts covering Hearthstone or whatever other crazy thing you're into, Squarespace can hook you up. That said, if you want to check out squarespace.com, you can get started with a free trial right now. When you're ready to launch your site, hit that link in the description below. You can get 10% off your first site or domain. It's a great deal. You won't regret it. That said, let's go ahead now and talk about our best mechs ever. Starting off with the 5th best, it's Snow Chugger. And you probably haven't thought about this card in a really long time, but there was an era in Hearthstone and Goblins versus Gnomes where Mech Mage was a particularly powerful deck, and it felt like Snow Chugger was a really big part of that, along with maybe one other mech we're going to see here in this top 5. But nice stat line. Unlike the Unpowered Mauler, you're getting this huge upside, and it only costs you 1 health. That's amazing. And it turns out that freeze is really nice. It can do things like shut down weapons. Warrior with Fiery War Axe suddenly can't attack thanks to your Snow Chugger. That's a big upside. It can trade into bigger minions to slow them down. And also, it just creates the nice basis for all the mech synergy stuff that Mech Mage was able to utilize. Whether that's cheating this into play, setting up your big 4-drop, or again, just going face for little chip damage, which Mage loves. This was an absolutely foundational mech for that Mech Mage deck. That was really the first mech deck I think we saw in Hearthstone, truly. And I think it has earned at least an honorary spot on this list for that very reason. So moving on to another card here, it's the Mech Warper, another card which popped into Mech Mage there to help you cheat out some crazy mechs, and has certainly popped into lots and lots of mech decks throughout time as well. Of course, it fueled a lot of stuff in its own standard format era before we had rotations, but even in wild format much later, this was a card that was still giving back to mech decks, whether that's some mech hunter stuff to help you cheat it out. There was the crazy snip snap OTK combo stuff in Warlock. Mech Warper helped fueled all of that because of its ridiculous mech discount, allowing for really high tempo plays. I don't even think I mentioned Mech Paladin. There's just a lot of things that have utilized Mech Warper very, very successfully. It turns out it's a great core piece to build around for aggressive mech decks and absolutely deserves to be here. Moving on to our number 3 spot, this is where the mechs kind of move beyond mech decks and enter the meta at large and have really, really big impacts. You might even be able to predict the top 2 cards on this list based on that descriptor. But up first is the Piloted Shredder, and this guy was really the ultimate tempo 4-drop for any kind of aggressive or mid-range deck. Back in the day for Hearthstone, he was just so sticky, so annoying, could pump in lots of chip damage thanks to that 4 attack, was awkward to deal with. Back in those days of Hearthstone, board shuffling and back and forth were way more difficult without all the different rush minions and really cheap removal tools. So Piloted Shredder was a sticky, awkward, annoying boy that definitely made an impact in all kinds of decks. It felt like this one was absolutely everywhere, and it felt really, really strong, particularly when it pooped out a Snow Chugger off of its Death Rattle. And of course, we get to remember Piloted Shredder still in Battlegrounds today as a terrible, forgotten card in most cases, very rarely chosen in Battlegrounds, but in Constructed, in its heyday, Piloted Shredder was absolutely everywhere and totally dominant. Speaking of cards that are everywhere, it's Snip Snap, a Boomsday Project card that wasn't really from the Boomsday Project, released as a special Rise of the Mech event, which was really, really cool. Little did we know how big of an impact Snip Snap would really have on Hearthstone, where it popped into almost every deck in combination with his good friend Ziliax. Spoiler alert, that's going to be your number 1, obviously. They were both just such great flexible mechs. Snip Snap in particular, something you could play on curve on 3. You had a nice sticky body with some Death Rattle tokens. So token decks, aggressive decks, control decks could all use that successfully to help challenge early game boards. And then you got a turn 6 drop, which isn't too bad either. Suddenly it's a really sticky 6 drop. It's got magnetic upsides with Ziliax or any other mechs. It's even something you could play on turn 9, maybe a couple magnetic sticks. For the 2, 4/6s melded together. Maybe you got one on the other side to kind of spread out your resources and challenge your opponent's removal. It was just this incredibly flexible tool that could do just about anything you wanted, and that's why so many decks ran Snip Snap. It entered that like rare 35-40% territory for decks, which is huge in Hearthstone, making it really one of the most popular cards of all time, let alone mechs. But of course, number 1 belongs to Ziliax. Much like his cousin Snip Snap, he was everywhere. And it hasn't been that long ago, so you probably haven't forgotten. Ziliax was in something like 50% of Hearthstone decks, or sometimes even more, which is absurd. That's the highest number I've ever seen monitoring the data for card inclusion in decks. And that's because, of course, he was a great tool for control decks, giving you that mid-game swing option, trade into some small stuff, heal up a little bit. He had that magnetic upside, both as himself, but followed up with other mechs as well, granting you tons of lifesteal for things like, Mech Warrior, Mech Control Warrior was everywhere nuts with Dr. Boom, thanks in part to Ziliax. But then Ziliax actually made his way into like aggro decks too. It turns out they didn't mind that mid-game swing either. Buy them an extra turn off the healing to find some more damage, find more pressure. That could be an important tool too. So Ziliax ended up being everywhere as this incredibly influential tool, and somehow despite that he never really felt overpowered or unbalanced. Ziliax is by many people's estimation the best card ever in Hearthstone, both from a power level and perhaps even sort of a design or balance standpoint. This one got pretty much everything right. Truly as good as it gets for Hearthstone, and certainly the best mech of all time. And there you go, folks. That's it for our video here. Thanks again to our sponsor, Squarespace, for this one. Much appreciated. And if you had any thoughts on these mechs, or maybe some mechs that you thought deserved to be on either of these lists, certainly feel free to share those in the comments below. I had some debates myself about what belonged here. It's purely subjective, of course, for these videos. It's my opinion, my memories. So if they're crazy, out of line, let me know in the comments. What do you think? What's the worst mech? What's the best mech? What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Share all that down below. Thanks much for watching, and until next time, game on.